Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. June 3rd marked the 40th anniversary of the movie War Games, famous for its depiction of war dialing, hacking, tab, tic-tac-toe, global thermonuclear war, and to quote character Stephen Falcon, a computer-enhanced hallucination, all of which sounds familiar today. We still have AT commands and mobile devices, we still have product placement, and we're still creating computer systems that hallucinate. Which means this week we chat with Sandy Carielli about the vendor floor at this year's RSA Conference and the amount of API security that was on display. In the news segment, an LLM top 10, old simple vulns, new security research, fun ways to learn, Burps API, and more. Start your modems and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Struggling to secure all your applications with modern identity services? You're not alone. But with identity orchestration, you can say goodbye to refactoring and complexity. Strata Identity helps you modernize app identity at scale while mitigating security risks and simplifying policy management. Maintain a consistent security posture and simplify policy management with identity orchestration. If you're ready to simplify your identity environment and improve your app security, share your IAM challenge with the Strata team to get a brand new set of earbuds. Just visit securityweekly.com/strata to learn more. That's securityweekly.com/strata. Imperva is the comprehensive digital security leader on a mission to help organizations protect their data and all paths to it. Only Imperva protects all digital experiences, from business logic to APIs, microservices, the data layer, and from vulnerable legacy environments to cloud-first organizations. With an integrated approach combining network, application, and data security, Imperva protects companies ranging from cloud-native startups to global multinationals with hybrid infrastructure. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva. This is episode 243, recorded June 5th, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mike, it's good to see you. One of these weeks, we are going to solve all the problems with application security.
All the problem?
Question is it this week?
Ooh, that is a good question. Let's keep people in suspense so they have to listen to the entire episode. Does John solve it all, or do I, once again, not? Before we solve everything, though, you must understand that our teams from Security Weekly and SC Media were on site at RSA Conference 2023, delivering in-depth reporting, analysis, and interviews from the conference. If you were unable to join us in person or didn't manage to catch our video live streams from Broadcast Alley, you can access all of our RSA 2023 coverage at securityweekly.com/RSAC. Sandy is a principal analyst at Forrester, advising security and risk professionals on application security, with a particular emphasis on the collaboration amongst security and risk, application development, operations, and business teams. Her research covers topics such as proactive security design, security testing in the software delivery lifecycle, protection of applications in production environments, and remediation of hardware and software flaws. Hello, Sandy. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mike. Great to be back. Hey, John.
It is great to have you back because we last chatted with you and Martha Bennett on Halloween in episode 218. So that was a fun one, and that was Web3 topics. But now we're talking about other three, I guess Web3 has 4 letters in it if you count the number, but 3-letter things, RSA, API, which I was trying to come up with AI with a P in it, but I'm not sure what direction I'm going to go there. But LLM, yes. You, Sandy, I got to meet you in person at RSA Conference, and we chatted for a little bit. And that's where you told me you ventured into the depths of Moria, also known as East and West Moscone vendor floors. Give us some of your impressions.
Yeah, it's the first time I've been back to RSA since the really weird RSA conference of 2020, which everyone has stories about sort of wandering around there and trying to figure out if it was safe to be there or not. But being back in 2023, it felt very similar to business as usual after a couple of years of not so much. And the thing that really got my attention, Mike, particularly wandering the South Expo, you could not trip without falling into an application security vendor. There were just, it it dominated the floor so much. And that was really something to see. A lot of vendors that maybe hadn't been there a few years ago, a lot of industries that maybe hadn't been there a few years ago, sub-industries of AppSec. It really is dominating the conversation. And we saw it also in the Innovation Sandbox. We saw a couple of application security vendors. I don't know if you wandered the early stage expo. I looked there and I just read through I did like a 15-minute walkthrough very quickly, looking at the names and the summaries of all of the vendors there. I counted 10 that were AppSec related there. There were a number of application security sessions, most of which I couldn't attend, but I got to a couple. There were a couple of keynotes on it. So the extent to which AppSec is really dominating the conversation, it's different from a few years ago. And, for me as an analyst that covers the industry, it's kind of fun just to see how much this space has exploded and how much attention people are paying to it.
And it obviously, for an application security podcast, that seems a pretty good thing. And everybody has a web application. That web application, in a way, that's the window, the door, whatever, your portal, choose your metaphor, into an app, into data, into our banking, into all sorts of things. But one of the things that stood out to me is a lot of these vendors, too, are talking about API security in particular, too, rather than just like web security or application security. And I'm curious, is API security just a new label, or is there something that's a bit more meaty in there that we should actually recognize as more than just web?
Yeah, I think there's a really good point to be made on there, because ultimately applications these days, a lot of them are made of APIs. And APIs, though, are not just the construct. And it's not just as simple as, okay, it's an API application, so you treat it like a web application. The challenge with API-based applications, and there are several, but one is a matter of scale, because you might be in an organization managing a couple hundred apps, but you could be managing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of APIs. That's part of it. But also remember that a lot of those APIs, unlike web applications where there's something usually tied to some sort of UI, you're usually able to track where the traffic is going, APIs could be machine to machine. There may not be any sort of visual indicator. You could have partner APIs. You could have internal APIs. You could have APIs tied to products that the customer owns. So it gets a lot more complicated to manage it. And it turns out that there's a lot of complexity with discovery, with authentication and authorization. And so the Venn diagram of application security and API security is not just a circle. There are pieces of this that certainly overlap, but there are also aspects of API security that are distinct.
Okay, and I think you may have missed it. 2 weeks ago, we tested Mr. John Kinsell's expertise in top 10 lists. And there is, in fact, an API security top 10 list. And a lot of the things on that list are broken. Broken this, broken that, another broken thing, another broken thing. Walk us through maybe some of what your impressions of that, the top 10 list for API security, or you mentioned a few of the things, I think, like authentication, authorization as well.
So this is actually really timely because the 2023 API security top 10 from OWASP just dropped. Like it's pretty much the 2023 version is brand new. The first version was 2019. That's been out for a while. They revved it pretty significantly this year in ways that I think make a lot of sense. One, there is a focus on discovery and inventory, and that is one of the areas where there is a lot of struggle. It comes down to the people don't know how many APIs are deployed in their environment. They don't know necessarily which versions of them. They don't know what data is being passed through. There are a lot of ways that can go wrong. But then to the point of broken, I assume you're referring to, I think there are three different items on the list around broken authorization, and then one more around broken authentication.
Right.
And the thing is, that seems to be an ongoing struggle for organizations to get the authentication, the authorization right. And the authorization can either be at the level of, who's allowed to call it, what they're allowed to call, or what data they're allowed to have back. And I think that describes the different types of authorization issues that were included on that list. On the authentication front, then, frankly, the question of whether the authentication is even in place. There have been a number of API-related breaches where they will come back and say that the issue was a quote-unquote, what do they say? Unauthenticated API endpoint, I think is the standard term that is used. To me, that means one of two things. One, it means they're aware of the API and they didn't get the authentication right. Two, it could also mean they weren't aware of the API and therefore they didn't do the authentication because they didn't know the API existed, and it goes back to the discovery. Either of which is possible.
Neither of those is a good situation, though. Not a good scenario.
But again, one of the common problems, and when I talk to organizations and when I talk to API security vendors, and we should talk about the vendor landscape at some point on this, when I talk to vendors, so many of them tell me about situations where they will discover in customer environments, another 50% more APIs that they weren't aware of.
Yeah, and that's what's crazy is that we have that common theme of just asset inventory. Easy to say, really hard to do, especially as you're pointing out for APIs, and the appreciation that it's not just web browsers and humans interacting with them. It's a lot of just service to service. And that's where, do we have mutual TLS or do we just call them because we think they're internal rather than exposed to the internet? And I'm curious too, on that aspect, as you were looking, tripping over through that vendor floor, where is the direction of API security going? Did you see a theme in the sense of WAFs with a new name, API gateways, which are the central points? So do all of your auth N, auth Z at this point? Is it more of just something else? Well, yeah, I'm curious about those themes and what those vendors were looking like.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because there are a couple of subsets of vendors here. You mentioned the API gateways. Those are often sold alongside an API management tool, although they're sometimes sold by just cloud vendors and WAF vendors as well. Those, to your point, they're handling the authentication, the authorization, the rate limiting. Then you also see web application firewall vendors that are doing what I would say is primarily policy, where you are potentially, uploading an API specification and using that to set policy around what traffic should be allowed. Now, that's assuming that traffic is coming in through the WAF, which is not always a safe assumption, but it's a start. And a lot of the WAFs have also added discovery, and that can be really useful, again, for discovering API traffic coming through the web application firewall. But the other thing I saw, while I was tripping over application security vendors, I was also, as a subset of that, tripping over API security specialists. I counted about a half dozen, I think primarily in the South Expo, I don't know why, but that were API security specialists. And that's something that's sprung up over the last 3 or 4 years, these specialty vendors that are really focused on API security. And they're focused on more of the entire life cycle. So they will be focused a lot. They started often on the protection side and added detection and some response, but they've also done some left shifting. They've added discovery, and importantly, they're starting to get into the testing realm as well. So they're more of end-to-end than most other types of application security right now, which is kind of interesting. That said, that is a lot of standalone API security vendors. And you asked where I think it's going. I think this industry is going to have to consolidate. Whether it's the API security specialists also buying into WAF and testing vendors, whether it's the other way around, the industry's got to come together on this.
So it sounds like we have a asset inventory problem keeping track of the assets of our vendors. But to sort of go back there on a more serious note, do you think, looking at the last 5 years of as we head more towards APIs, is this going to make the asset inventory side of things better or worse since we have tools like this which are attempting to manage that? I mean, I heard of I heard of a user last week who had somewhere in the neighborhood of over 1 million Lambda functions.
Why?
And that's not everyone, but so, and obviously there's going to be some amount of APIs hooked up to that and cloud and all that, but like, do you see are we heading, is that funnel becoming narrower or more open, I guess?
Near term, it's been a struggle for a lot of organizations, and I think a lot of organizations are still pretty early on their API security journey, and we still get a lot of questions on the basics of discovery. So I think the ones that are, midway through starting to mature their API security, they are addressing the discovery pieces. But then there's a whole bunch of governance that has to come into play there to continue to manage and work with that well. So, near term, I think it's going to be a struggle, John. But if we go 3 to 5 years out, maybe I will be a little bit more optimistic. Maybe.
Maybe that's clearly, what John's pointing out, that scale problem that you alluded to as well, Sandy, there that you have to have tooling to deal with something like that. And so I'm curious, when people do come to you with questions about API security, could you characterize some of those questions? Meaning, are they coming from, we don't have anything, we're low maturity, we have an API, we know it's supposed to be secured from either because of governance, we've figured that part out at least, or we want to enable and empower our developers to do so, or is it coming from something else? And just kind of curious, is that thinking any different from web security a while ago?
Yeah, it's a good question. And if you asked me about a year ago, I think the questions I would often get were in two main categories. One was specifically around API discovery. And it would be around, what are the tools available? How do we do this? How do we solve that problem? I think there was a lot of awareness, and there's continuing to be some awareness that this is something that organizations have to solve. And even in the course of my interviews of end users for my upcoming API security research that I'm collaborating with some team members on, we do see discovery called out pretty frequently as a specific thing that folks are paying attention to. But the other piece of it, the other thing that I would sometimes get was a more general, okay, we have APIs. We know we have APIs. We know we need to secure them. What should we be doing here? What does an API security program look like? The other part of that is, what can we use? Because as we talked about, web application firewalls have some API security components to them. API gateways have some API security components to them. So there's this challenge of, what do we already have that we can use to address API security? Are there any gaps in it based on our existing deployment, our existing tooling, our existing processes, or do we need to purchase something else or add some additional processes to close those gaps?
I'm curious too, because, talk about the WAF or an API gateway in particular, those tend to be, I think it's fair to say, drop that in front of your API, whether you're writing it from scratch now or it's legacy and it's a 10, even 20-year-old, amount of code. Probably for the most part, you can add that shim in front of it. You don't need to modify the code. You don't need to customize anything about it. Is that common with the other tooling as well? Or do you see tooling like, I'm going to throw out some RASP or some IAST in there that have been attempted in the past with the web, I will say in scare quotes. Are people, writing their APIs differently with these tools, or the tools really just drop in? And I'm not sure that there's a judgment part of that question, but more of just a philosophy.
RASP and IAST are interesting, and I would say I don't hear as much about either of those these days, but I don't think people are writing their APIs differently for those. Where I do see things done differently a little bit might be if a web application firewall, one of the things they might do in the course of discovery is, based on that, recreate an up-to-date specification file and pass that back to the dev team. Because let's face it, we can say a best practice is to keep your specs up to date. We can say a best practice is to keep your documentation up to date, but I live in the real world. So, there are lots of things that have to get done. So one of the things that WAF does help with, potentially, is helping to keep some of those specs updated. But that's an aspect of WAF helping with development rather than developers doing anything differently. What I do see differently on the development side is less to do with tooling and more to do with governance and process. Because what we have today, and my colleague David Muda writes about that, there's a standard practice that he's seeing in a lot of organizations that are API heavy where they create specific API COEs. and they're creating API taxonomies because there's a need to be managing, which APIs are meant to be customer facing, which ones are partner facing, which ones are internal facing, which ones are dealing in PII and therefore need additional attention and protections, which ones are not. There's a lot of classification and taxonomy that's going into a mature API governance program that maybe didn't exist in standard application development in the same way.
That's interesting. I think it ties in where I was going to take the question into, in this wealth of API security tools, how are they serving, or even are they serving, the developers? Because some of what you're describing there is like a center of excellence is looking at, here's our noun-verb structure of the API interface. Here is what we return. Here's what our contracts look like. These are very important because you get opinionated developers who think how they must be, but they're developers writing for other developers. And I'll let you answer this in a second, but I want to add something else to this question. You also mentioned, left shifting, the idea that, I don't think you implied that suddenly developers are responsible for all these tools. They have to run the tools. The better nuance there is expanding the security into developer world. But are those security tools actually helping them in some way? That's the short version of that. Very long question.
All right, let me see if I can remember the first part of that question by the time you got through it. To your point, a lot of the API processes I described are much more the developer processes, and security is coming into that party already in progress. So to some extent, that's good news for security because there is a little bit more, I would say, discipline and taxonomy that they can be working with, which is good for them. In terms of the tooling itself, ideally, we should be integrating this into the pipeline the way we would with SAST and DAST and IAST and SCA. And maybe in the most mature organizations, they're starting to do that with API testing. But API testing is still evolving. There are a couple of API security vendors that have API-specific security testing included, and that can integrate reasonably into the pipeline. A lot of the DAST testing out there can do some amount of API security testing, so that can be incorporated a little bit. The other tools, it's a little bit more of a mishmash. Some are a little bit more mature in this area than others, but if the tool itself has integration into the pipeline, then it can be doing the testing and feeding back results to developers in the same way that you would with other application security testing. So it's not that dev is running the tools, but it's ultimately that dev is still responsible for the remediation.
Gotcha. Part of what you're describing too is, a lot of the consolidation within this space. In terms of not necessarily naming names, but in terms of the tools that can work within the pipeline versus those tools that don't, are there certain approaches to these tools or types of tools that you see these will be the ones that likely are consolidating because they're providing value, or other tools that are going to basically just lose to evolution because they're not doing something in that left shifting approach and that delivering value to developer approaches? Sort of a lesson, if you will, for our API security vendors.
It's a good lesson, and it's been interesting to see pretty much every API security specialist start to offer more of the left shifting functionality. I would say they are newer to that than to some of the policy detection response pieces. There were a couple of vendors that started more in the integration into the pipeline space, so it's not universal, but many of them started more on the right. But we're seeing that move left, and I think to your point, there was that realization that they couldn't fully address the need if they weren't thinking that way, and that there was some white space there for them to go after because it wasn't necessarily being fully addressed by the other vendors in the space.
Now, one of the themes, speaking of vendors, was that, we talk about API security, a lot of the authentication, authorization. Authorization does lead into a little bit the data security aspect in terms of who has access, but doesn't necessarily talk about what type of data it's handling. And you alluded to this earlier. You mentioned it was part of the policy, part of the governance. Do you see tooling there that can either just identify the types of data handling here, or are there tools that go beyond that auth-N, auth-Z aspects of data protection in this area?
So I'm not necessarily seeing authorization based on sort of proactively figuring out what data is being passed back and forth.
Sure.
There's still going to be the need to do the classification beforehand. But if you're using your discovery tooling to understand what data is coming in and leaving at that stage and using discovery, then use that to classify the API the right way and therefore set the authentication authorization guidelines.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm thinking of there's so much here on the governance aspect. Are there tools that are helping that governance, or are we still in the land of this is a spreadsheet and that's what everybody's been using and it still works?
You know, you should have my colleague David Mutter on one of these days. He covers API management. And I think one of the things that's, a part of the API management are those pieces of governance. Because part of what API management is doing is allowing developers to set up their structure, understand who's building, how it should be built, how things should be classified and controlled. And so that's sort of it bridges the gap between security and dev a little bit, but I'm finding that some of that, is being handled to some extent by API management. Now, are we also seeing a spreadsheet problem? I mean, I wouldn't be shocked. I think the difference is we do have API specs with API security and API development, and so it's not just a matter of having to list the name of the API in a spreadsheet and the data and who owns it. You do have the spec you can fall back on.
Curious if there's an aspect, kind of going back to the OWASP Top 10, because OWASP Top 10 has different purposes or different approaches. It's talking about risks, and governance is not necessarily one of the risks, I think, that gets called out in these lists. And if you look at the 2019 version, it was talking about mass assignment, which is very kind of Ruby-specific technology, although there can be other tech stacks that are vulnerable to that. It also had insufficient logging and monitoring, both of which have actually disappeared. So we have more into security misconfiguration, which is pretty much on every top 10 list out there. There's an improper assets management. So I think that speaks to your discovery. Also an unsafe consumption of APIs. So I don't know, trying to form a question here. Do you see top 10 lists like this? And I'm going to make you, create one on the spot, Sandy. Apologies. But, how much of the governance aspect is either missing or should be part of these top 10 lists or instructive to them? Or should we be really just focusing on, here's the tech stack, here is implementation details or design details to get rid of these vuln classes?
So I will argue that the governance is implied in several of the items on the OWASP Top 10.
Fair enough.
I think it's implied in discovery, and I think it's implied in a lot of the authorization failures. Because in order to get those pieces right, you have to have the governance right. If you don't have the governance right, you are probably making mistakes in those areas. They go hand in hand.
Oh, that's interesting because it is and to be clear, it's object level authorization, object property level authorization, and function level authorization. So, we need to authorize everything. And is that, putting on an easy developer hat or, be kind to our developers, is this something that API Gateway actually makes a lot easier for developers? I'm just kind of thinking, where's the tool that's going to help them kick out, 3 of these top 10 items?
It's mostly the gateways that are handling authorization today. That's where most of the work is being done. There aren't really a lot of other tools that people are leveraging for that. And even when you talk with API security vendors, they will often talk about their integrations with gateways.
I'm going to go back to previous point for a moment. Because I think you said something, there was a joke in the back of my head of Next thing we're going to have top 10 lists for GRC and then top 10 lists. I get it, right? It's and
Yeah.
it's sort of similar. I've been talking to friends about ChatGPT from the point. I'm going somewhere with this, but ChatGPT from the point of view of the reason it's popular right now is because it allows people to wrap their heads around and do something easily. So I get it. But back on that point around governance, I think what you said is actually, at least to me, it was sort of off camera. You probably saw my head sort of went
Yeah.
sideways. Does the average, I'll say, consumer of top 10, of OWASP top 10, do they understand that there is governance built in? There is a aspect of governance, I'll say required, not built in, on consumption of that list. So you've got that top
Yeah.
10 list of brokens. Do people realize that they don't just buy the tool which says, hey, we fixed top 10, but then what are the checks and balances around that?
It's a good question.
Thank you.
I'm going to say that there are probably some that don't realize it, but I also think that API management was ahead of API security.
I'll give you that.
And so there's some level of governance that came with the management, even if, and here's where the disconnect may be, John, even if the security team wasn't necessarily aware of that governance and leveraging that for security. That may be the missing piece. Some amount of governance was in place via the management, but there wasn't necessarily an awareness and an understanding of how that connected to the security requirements before.
Yeah. And the other aspect, which is interesting to this, which I'm hoping helps the security of this become, I'll say, more manageable, since these API things are relatively new and they tend to grow like rabbits on a field, and we realize most of us realize we have to have some level of control and management around them. I'm hoping that helps with the security overall, sort of going back to the previous few comments we've made here.
Yes, I think the more that security is involved in the governance, involved in the management, it's going to make the security part of it easier, absolutely.
And then do you have, in the conversations you've had with people coming to you, what should we be doing with API security? Do you have some suggestions for how that collaboration, how that security involvement can be successful, can be collaborative?
A couple of pieces that come to mind in that. First of all is, to some extent, what is your relationship with development, and are you engaged with the API COE at all? By the way, that doesn't mean taking it over. I think API COEs are doing a lot of really good work in this, and when there's something like that in place, let the people who are running that run it. But engaging and providing the information to development about, what are the risks, what's necessary, all of that stuff, certainly important. Honestly, the other piece I'm going to throw in here is incredibly boring, and yet make it easy for devs to do the testing, do the remediation. Don't be throwing stacks of findings on them 2 weeks before release. All of the same things that we've been preaching in general. None of that changes with API security. We still would like to make this not a nightmare for development.
No, and that's a great message, because especially if there's all this consolidation and the tools are shifting everywhere, suddenly we have more visibility into the API. Look at all this risk. Look at all these vulns we have to fix. But maybe we actually don't have to fix them. It's a risk calculation, not a volume.
Yeah. Everything else, we've got to treat this as a risk and prioritization exercise, and we have to build this into the pipeline as much as possible. We need to make it easy to remediate. We need to make it easy for developers to understand what the critical issues are. I mean, I feel a bit like a broken record on some of this, because it's all the same things that I've been talking about, that you both have been talking about for years and years. The fact that it's APIs, and this is one of the aspects of the Venn diagram where it's still within the overlapping circle, you still need to make it easy for dev.
Still do. And Sandy, you were teasing a report that you are working on coming out later this year. Anything you want to highlight, either how to participate in it, or when to start looking for when that might be revealed?
So I'm terrible at predicting when these things are actually going to be released because I have no control over editing. But let's say sometime in the next few months the first one will be out. I'm doing a series with a couple of my colleagues on this. And the first one is going to be kind of a high level, the key components of API security. So a lot of what we've been talking about, discovery, authentication, authorization, but then also talking about testing, talking about detection, talking about policy, all of these different pieces, and talking about the importance of looking at each of those for a comprehensive API security program. I think what we're realizing, both from the conversations we have with users and customers and through things like the OWASP top 10 list and just the number of breaches we've seen, is that API security is, surprise, surprise, not magic pixie dust that we can drop into one place in the pipeline. I wish it were. But we do have to look at it holistically. And like AppSec itself, we are looking at it end to end.
We're looking at it end to end. And Sandy, we started off talking about a top 10 list, but we now need to constrain you down to 3 words. We ask all of our guests to describe AppSec in 3 words. So we would love to know what your response to that is.
All right. Well, the cheeky response is why I'm paid.
Okay.
But the better answer, and it's too bad it's not 4 because I've got a good one for 4 words, but since you're constraining me to 3, trust, collaboration, integration.
And I think those are all commas in there rather than trust that AppSec can actually figure out collaboration, just to be a little bit of snarky on our industry peers.
Yes. If I was going to choose a different one, I'd say breaking down silos, but I think that applies to most aspects of security, although there's an extra importance with AppSec given some of the development and DevOps relationships. But let's stick with trust, collaboration, and integration. And you can remove the "and" because that would make it 4 words.
Will do. Although I still like why I'm paid, so I'm going to stick with that. Like you, Sandy, we don't have control over our own editing. So Tyson and Tom are going to start to get antsy with us. So we're going to have to wrap it up here. I apologize, but this was a wonderful conversation. Thank you again, Sandy.
Thanks for having me. Talk to you soon.
Thanks again, John. Thanks everybody for joining us. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.